Good evening, good afternoon, and of course, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the first World Emerging Security Forum hosted by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Korea. My name is Jessica Lee, and today I've given the honor of being your MC for this very special occasion. Thank you. Thank you very much. And today's forum will be held under the theme of the future of international cooperation in response to emerging security threats. For 2 days, today and tomorrow, the 2021 WESF will be held, both online and offline, according to the quarantine guidelines to prevent the spread of COVID-19. And it will be live streamed online on the official YouTube channel of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Korea. The first World Emerging Security Forum is held to share awareness of the current situation of emerging security threats and to cultivate a consensus on the future direction of transnational cooperation based on a systematic evaluation of our achievements and limitations in responding to emerging security threats. And starting with today's opening ceremony and the session 1, we will have a special round table session and a session 2 and a session 3 tomorrow. So we'd like to ask for your active participation until the very end. And for your information, our forum is being held under the strict COVID-19 prevention measures. All staff and participants at the venue here check their temperatures before entering the hall, and we've done disinfection thoroughly as well. And we also have installed a screen between our presenters on the stage. So ladies and gentlemen, please understand that our speakers were present without having their masks on. Thank you very much for your cooperation. Then without further ado, let us begin the opening ceremony of the first World Emerging Security Forum. First and foremost, ladies and gentlemen, please allow me to introduce Mr. Chung Eui-yong, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Korea, for his opening remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome him with a big round of applause.
Good evening, President Toomas, Hendrik, Ilves, Chairman Klaus, Schwab. We have him on the internet. Chairman Schmidt, and Vice Chairman Eui-yong, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I thank you very much for joining us in this inaugural meeting of the World Emerging Security Forum. And would like to invite you to take the long view, both in looking back at the past as well as looking ahead into the future on what security has meant and should mean to us going forward. Security threats have been traditionally perceived as physical conflict involving the use of weapons. Looking back, however, it is striking to note that the level of military violence among countries has steadily come down. In terms of the frequency of physical harm that human beings inflicted on each other, even accounting for the horrible wars of the past century, there has been a steady but clear decline in violence. There are many factors that contributed to this trend, but the key ones would be the rise of literacy and education, eradication of poverty, and the spread of democracy and respect for human rights. We can observe a clear correlation between the improvement in these standards and the rise in the human faculty to resolve differences through peaceful means. In particular, the unmistakable trend for democratic countries to not fight each other, a phenomenon that is famously known as democratic peace, reminds us again the value and universality of democratic principles, not only for domestic governance, but also to ensure international peace and security. But we are gathered here today because despite this progress, we still do not feel completely safe and secure. And when I say we, I mean mainly us, more as individuals than as citizens of our respective countries. Indeed, the concept of human security that has been developed in recent years captures the importance of addressing the threats that fall outside the traditional boundaries of interstate military conflict. All of us have been deeply impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic for the past 2 years. More than 5 million people have lost their lives to the pandemic in less than 2 years. More than double the military casualties of the World War II. I only hope that this will be a temporary setback in human history and that in the coming months we will recover to return to a new normalcy. Today I had a virtual meeting with foreign ministers of 14 Pacific Island countries. They all expressed their deep concerns about the ongoing threats stemming from the pandemic. But they all argued that the biggest and the most imminent and long-term threat comes from climate change and dealing with its effects, ranging from extreme weather events, rising sea level, and shrinking biodiversity, all of which will uproot the way of life as we know it. They said in one voice that it is not the future that is at stake. It is the present which is at stake. Then there are the risks that come hand in hand with the benefits we enjoy from a connected and automated world. Our threats to cybersecurity range from the mundane crash of our mobile phones and computers to a system-wide failure that could cripple our infrastructure. Korea is recently suffering from an abrupt disruption in supply chain of previously not well-known urea solution. Many automobile makers around the world is busy dealing with the sudden decrease of supply of semiconductors. These are just a few of the emerging security issues that we felt deserved a dedicated forum where we can try to make better sense of what lies ahead, both in terms of the threat and, more importantly, how we should respond. If the threat is global, the response must also be global. Unfortunately, in our ongoing collective response to COVID and to climate change, we have seen how difficult it can be to let go of our state-centric habits and biases to be truly collective. We have also come to realize that today's security threats know no border drawn by men. No one can be free and safe until everyone is free and safe. Emerging security threats cannot be resolved by the efforts of any one country alone. This is not to say that nation-states are irrelevant. On the contrary, each government has a critical role to play in mobilizing civil society, academia, and business, as well as making the connection across borders. We need to learn to become more flexible and nimble to ensure that the right player at the right time, at the right place, can make the optimal intervention against these emerging threats. Governments have the authority and the responsibility, and therefore should also have the humility to make these hard choices. Today, as we are joined by leading experts of various nationalities and specialties, I hope we can agree on one thing, that solidarity and cooperation is the only way to tackle new challenges in international peace and security. In May of last year, President Moon Jae-in declared Korea's commitment to take on a leading role in constructing a new world order based on solidarity and cooperation in the post-pandemic era. And this forum is part of our efforts to implement the commitment. Sun Tzu, the famous strategist and philosopher of ancient China, said that if you know your enemy and if you know yourself, you will win all 100 of 100 battles. I hope the conference today and tomorrow will serve as one of many occasions for us to better understand our emerging threats and to explore how best we can realign ourselves to come up with a truly collective and effective response. Thank you very much.
Minister, thank you very much for your meaningful words. Thank you. So our minister said that solidarity and cooperation is the only way to tackle the new challenges in peace and security. And the Republic of Korea will lead the way in resolving these emerging security threats as well. Thank you, Minister, once again. And then there will be some congratulatory remarks from honorable guests from abroad who could share with us their insights on emerging security threats. So first of all, we will have a video of the congratulatory remark delivered by Klaus Schwab, a founder and executive director of the World Economic Forum. So he has prepared us a very meaningful video. So ladies and gentlemen, let's get our attention to the screen with a big round of applause.
Dear Minister Chung, distinguished participants and friends, I'm grateful to be invited to speak here at the inaugural World Emerging Security Forum. I commend the efforts of the government of the Republic of Korea and in particular the initiative of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in bringing together leading voices to discuss the current landscape for emerging security issues and leverage multilateral cooperation to build stronger resilience for the international community. Korea's role as a trusted and able interlocutor between East and West and bridging emerging and developed economies is now important more than ever in an increasingly polarized world. I would like to begin by sharing my perspective on the global security outlook. My main concern in this regard are the growing threats to human security we are facing from multiple fronts. First, many families, workers and small businesses around the world continue to face economic insecurity. This stems from an unequitable economic recovery in the wake of the pandemic, within and between countries. Most worryingly, in a large part of the developing world, a low COVID vaccination rate is still putting many people at risk of spiraling into poverty. Without a global vaccination drive, the poor and vulnerable will suffer the most in years to come. But all over the world, we must be concerned about the knock-on economic effects of the pandemic. Even in countries that introduced massive economic and monetary stimuli, unemployment, bankruptcies, inflation, or debt obligations may worsen as those stimuli are scaled back. All of this leaves us in a very fragile economic state. According to the World Economic Forum's Global Risk Perception Survey, which was conducted in September, just 11% of respondents believe the world's economy will accelerate over the coming years. Second, in many countries, the pandemic exacerbated nationalistic tendencies. Those tendencies are exposing vulnerable groups within society to heightened societal insecurity in the form of discrimination, marginalization, xenophobia, or even political violence. Migrants and refugees are facing an especially concerning and worrying outlook. It may sound counterintuitive, but those nationalistic tendencies are not good for the social cohesion, even among citizens of a given country. They are dividing, not uniting. In our survey, social cohesion erosion, in fact, appears as a top concern for the next 2 years. Lastly, and more people are becoming at risk of environmental security because of the worsening effects of climate change, extreme heat and droughts, severe rain and flooding, and growing resource scarcity. As many as 216 million people globally could be displaced by climate change towards 2050. And once more, environmental risks were perceived by the World Economic Forum Global Risk Perception Surveys respondents as the most concerning and the most severe of the next decade. It is in this context that I would like to share 3 reasons why the World Emerging Security Forum is so relevant and opportune. First, global threats, because of their nature, must be met with global responses. Financial crisis, global warming, pandemics, cyber attacks, and I could go on. Those are all borderless risks whose damage has the potential to spread fast and wide, regardless of where they originate. The world has learned this the hard way after the 2008-2009 financial crisis, the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, and an unrelenting planetary emergency. However, this does not mean that our efforts to combat those crises and risks are meaningless and futile. The contrary is true. Global crises have epicenters and tipping points. If countries at those crucial junctures swiftly warn the world about them and act as first responders, their global spread may be prevented or limited. This is the reason why the World Economic Forum supports the World Emergency Security Forum by creating an inclusive, neutral, and transparent global platform focused on emerging threats. The World Emerging Security Forum can represent truly a global early warning system. Second, we need eyes everywhere to spot a bushfire before it becomes a wildfire. But we also need long and strong pipes to channel water to the fire quickly. This brings me to the second purpose of the World Emerging Security Forum, establishing links between the diverse actors here today to prevent cooperative mechanisms from fragmenting in times of crisis. Because global threats are borderless and can originate anywhere, it is in every actor's best interest to participate in international, global cooperation systems. Infectious diseases are a case in point. The world has achieved remarkable progress towards mitigating COVID-19 through a combination of international cooperation for vaccine development in record time and national vaccination programs. But only a handful of countries have vaccinated more than 70% of their population, while in more than 50 countries, vaccination remains below 10%. As we have learned from AIDS, malaria, or tuberculosis, no country is fully immune until every country is immune. The same is true for climate change. No country will be safe from devastating weather, natural resource scarcity, or the damages of pollution on human health until the whole world is committed to international climate action. Third, while the world has been struggling for decades with the familiar threats of climate change, cybercrime, or pandemics, the reality is that new unintended consequences may result from those threats that we are still unaware of, while even new threats may emerge altogether. Global risks are not static. They evolve with and are a consequence of human activities. This is the third reason why I applaud the World Emerging Security Forum, its future orientation. International cooperation has, is, and will be constantly tested during crisis. So, it must also keep evolving. We may not know what, when, or where the next global threat will emerge. But we also know that staying vigilant for early warning signs, maintaining a constant flow of information, and ensuring that different voices are heard will be critical to address the threat when the time comes. As I conclude my remarks, I want to commend you again, Minister Chung, for taking the initiatives to host this World Emerging Security Forum. After the crisis the world has faced in recent years, this multilateral forum is a welcome antidote against rising isolationism. At the World Economic Forum, too, we continue to bring the world together to create a better world for all and better respond to future security threats. It is why we will convene again in January, in person, in Davos, under the banner, working together, restoring trust. And throughout our history, we have always advocated stakeholder responsibility, public-private cooperation, and global cooperation. Those pillars continue to be the basis of what we do and to be the crucial building blocks for creating a better global future. I wish you all the best at this forum, and I look forward to working together with you all in the future and restore the trust in our common future.
Thank you very much for your insight and meaningful words. And next, we will have a very special guest who are joining us here on site. It's my great honor and privilege to introduce Mr. Toomas Hendrik Ilves, former President of the Republic of Estonia, for his congratulatory remarks. So His Excellency will be coming up to the stage. And ladies and gentlemen, please welcome him with a big round of applause.
Well, good evening. Let me first begin by thanking the Foreign Minister and the Forum for inviting me here to Seoul, a place that I've been to several times before. I will actually talk very briefly about actually more traditional threats in a new environment. Estonia, my country, and Korea are very successful countries, democratic countries, that both live in a rough neighborhood. We are not safe from all kinds of security threats the way maybe some other countries are. Now, I want you to think about security threats. If you remember the movie 2001, A Space Odyssey, there was a big moment where the pre-human ape discovers he has a weapon, and he can actually take a bone and kill someone else by using a bone to hit someone on the head. That was symbolically the beginning of force and threats to security in a kinetic world. As you recall, Newton's second law of dynamics is that force equals mass times acceleration. And that has been true of conflict and war since that hypothetical ape, through throwing rocks, through shooting spears and arrows, all the way to bullets and tanks and missiles. War has been always kinetic. Now, I would say with the turn of the millennium, we have reached a new phase. From our own experience in my country and lots of other countries, we see that you don't need kinetic force to threaten or to destroy or overthrow a country, basically to attack the fundamental security of a nation. You can do it by hacking. You can do it by doing a DDoS attack, as happened in my country in 2007, and render all crucial websites and banks inaccessible. You can do a SCADA, or System Control and Data Acquisition attack, as happened with Stuxnet, and you can basically shut down an entire program. Now, what we should realize now is that we have entered basically at the same time as the new millennium, an era in which we don't have to, or we cannot only worry about things such as tanks, missiles, and bombs. We actually, if you think through the security environment, then in the future, in any future war, the tank is part of a mop-up operation. The war will be won long before any bullets are fired, any missiles are flown. It will be won by shutting down countries, by having no electricity, by having no mobile phones, by having no military communications. So basically what this means is that we have to rethink our entire approach to security. Right now, all of our countries put huge amounts of money into hardware, new weapons, new defenses. Well, in the future, we will have to do that, but we will have to do something else, which is develop a new form of security thinking. When you get to a point in which war and conflict and at least state-on-state attacks are no longer a matter of mass times distance divided by time, because there is none of that, you realize that the geography of threat and security has changed dramatically. It is there's a microsecond difference between an attack on Estonia and an attack on Korea. It's just a microsecond. That's it. And there are no measurable, at least, mass to the electrons. However, what we have seen is you can shut down countries. You can alter the political environment of a country, as we have seen several times in the past several years, or you can alter public views on vaccination, all through disinformation, through social media, not through spreading chemical biological weapons, but by making people not want to be vaccinated. Now, I won't talk for long, but let me just say that there are other implications of this which also offer some solutions. For one, what this development in security policy has done is that it has eliminated geography, which up till now has been the primary concern of security thinking, because you had kinetic weapons. You knew where weapons were coming from, or missiles were coming from. You were worried about your neighbors. Now we have to be worried about everybody. On the other hand, it gives us new opportunities, and this is my sort of parting thought for my introduction, is that we can rethink the whole concept of alliances and get beyond geography for alliances. What is NATO? It's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. People say, why isn't Japan there? Why isn't Korea? Why isn't New Zealand or Australia? Well, that's because none of those countries are in the North Atlantic. It's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization because of bomber range, fighter refueling, tank logistics, troop transport. Those will be irrelevant in a future conflict, or they will be relevant only after the conflict. So what I would say, one thing we should do is start thinking about an alliance of liberal democracies, those countries that respect, that have free and fair elections, that respect fundamental rights and freedoms and human rights, rule of law, and those countries are not geographically isolated in one place. And I would say that our new security policy thinking for the traditional threats of state-to-state conflict needs to rethink itself in this era where we're faced with digital threats, yet we also have absolutely new digital opportunities for bringing liberal democracies together. So I hope people will think about these possibilities. I would welcome and love to see countries like mine together with Korea in an alliance of democracies for defense. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for your very warm word, and thank you for visiting Korea to attend today's forum. And I believe your presence makes this forum all the more meaningful. Thank you once again. With that, please allow me to introduce Mr. Eric Schmidt, who was the CEO of Google and former chair of the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence, for his words of congratulation. So he sent us a video of his remarks. So ladies and gentlemen, let's get our attention to the screen with a big round of applause.
Good evening to everybody in Seoul. I'm honored to have this invitation to speak at the World Emerging Security Forum. I've traveled to Korea many, many times, and I frankly just love Korea. I love the people, I love the culture, and I particularly love the food. And I also love the innovation agenda that you all have established over the last decades that I have been there. What you've been able to do, for example, with semiconductors, and in particular with the leadership of Samsung, has been extraordinary. And the fact that Samsung and then TSMC over in Taiwan are the two leading semiconductor manufacturers at the state of the art is a tremendous achievement for Korea, given how difficult this kind of stuff is. What I wanted to do is talk a little bit about security. I was the chair of the U.S. National Security Commission for the last 3 years, and we produced a voluminous report a few months ago, which you can read at nscai.gov. And in it, we track the progress of AI technology and its use in national security. The first thing that we find is that China has decided to emphasize AI at almost over everything else. And in particular, there are more PhDs, more papers, and more students than in the West. So we know they're coming, and we know they're doing well at it. I judge we to be slightly ahead of them, but not very far. And I think there's every reason to believe that we're going to have a contest between the Chinese system for AI and the Western. And I'm quite convinced that South Korea will be on the Western side for many, many, many reasons. The important thing that I can tell you is that you're going to have to embrace these technologies and run as fast as you can. I mean, and I know you can do it. I was studying COVID. I spent a lot of time looking at COVID around the world, and the best country in terms of COVID performance by far at this point has been South Korea. You're a democracy, and yet you managed to get through the necessary restrictions. You didn't politicize things. You took a position of health, and you have lots of good compliance with the appropriate public policy rules. That has enabled you to spring back in a way that almost no other country can. And I think there's every reason to believe that with your vaulted energy, this extraordinary innovation that exists within Korea, and especially with a new focus on software, you'll get there. When I started going to Korea, Korea was largely a specialized zone. The technologies didn't work with others, and there was an obsession with gaming. And out of that gaming technology came incredible VR startups. And also out of that self-contained nature, everything got integrated. And so all of your phones are now what we use here in the United States, et cetera. I have every reason to believe that you can build global platforms in South Korea based on AI that will change the world. What we found in our report is that we have a talent shortage. America has a talent shortage. I'm sure you do as well. We need to get more people who understand artificial intelligence in the government. We also found that it was very important to maintain our leadership ahead of China. That's why Samsung's leadership is so crucial to what we need globally in the West. The innovation that you all provide needs to be doubled and doubled again so we can build these new platforms. We need to do partnerships around emerging security, and you need to be part of these democratic initiatives, so-called D10, T12, of like-minded nations that want to collaborate to build systems of AI that are responsible in their use and reflect democratic values. That is not the values of an autocracy. And these include the values of lack of surveillance and the ability to have free speech, and things that I know my friends in South Korea really, really care a lot about. In my case, I felt so strongly about this that I have created a successor to the AI Commission, which is called the Special Competitive Studies Project, which I'm funding, run by some partners of mine. And what they're going to do is try to establish a real focus on how do we make Western-based global platforms the coin of the realm. And I say coin because money matters as well. And there's every reason to believe that these platforms that we're going to build, starting from AI, including quantum and others, will create enormous next generation of value. I was fortunate in my career to end up in one of the companies that has become the defining company of the last age. The next companies, and indeed the established players, are all going to compete to establish these new AI platforms. I felt so strongly about it, I wrote a book with Dr. Henry Kissinger and Dan Huttenlocher called The Age of AI and Our Human Future. And I encourage you to read it when it's available in Korea. The important thing about my message today is that what you're doing is working. We need to have even more investment in technology, especially for the security of South Korea, especially given the threats from North Korea, and especially with this brutal competition that we're going to be seeing from China. What I know is that working together, South Korea and the United States and all of our like-minded universities, we can win. And I want to win with you. Thank you so, so much for letting me speak today. I look forward to coming back to Korea very, very soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts and insights. Thank you once again. And next, we'd like to invite Mr. Wei Xiaojun, Vice President of the China Semiconductor Industry Association, to deliver his words of congratulations. So he's joining us in real time to give us his remarks. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you for the introduction. Dear Mr. Chung, ladies and gentlemen, good evening, good morning, and good afternoon. Thank you to the forum for giving me this opportunity to say a few words. In the past 2 decades, the information technology and the industry represented by internet and the mobile communication, especially combination of the two, mobile internet, have greatly promoted development of the global economy. The most important achievement during this period was the unification of technological standards. The unification has brought about the globalization of products, markets, industries, and the supply chain, reduced the cost of information products and the services, and greatly promotes the prosperity of the global economy. However, everything has both positive and negative side. The development of information technology not only brings benefits to all mankind, but also raises concerns such as privacy protection, national security, as well as the impact of long-term use of the internet on the teenagers' health. Obviously, it's impossible for us to live without information technology, without internet, without mobile communication. And these challenges can only be solved through technological innovation and the global cooperation, not by any country alone. I think this is the important significance of this forum. Thank you so much for inviting me and wish the forum accomplish success. Thank you.
Mr. Xiaojun, thank you very much for your time today, and thank you for your meaningful words. And once again, we would like to extend our sincere gratitude to all of our distinguished guests. Thank you once again. And I believe Minister Chung Eui-yong and other 4 speakers' remarks suggested the importance of seeking multidimensional and integrated cooperation measures against not only health, cyberspace, or any technologies, but also various other emerging security threats and the possibility of developing international cooperation and also solidarity. I also believe that concrete measures will be explored through this first World Emerging Security Forum. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you once again. And we'll now take a commemorative photo with honorable guests who are joining us today. And those who are watching this forum via online platforms, please take a short break and please come back at 7 p.m. Korean Standard Time for joining our session 1. Thank you very much.
What if new infectious diseases shatter our daily lives? What if we become targets of cyber attacks? What if we lose control over new technologies? Emerging security challenges are multiplying rapidly. Global crises are threatening our lives and safety. Now is the time to stand together against emerging security threats. Eminent experts around the world are providing the way forward for global cooperation. The first World Emerging Security Forum.
Good evening, good morning, and of course, good afternoon, honorable guests, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the first World Emerging Security Forum, and welcome back to the session 1 entitled Health Security Session. So this forum is hosted by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Korea, and welcome everyone. And my name is Jessica Lee, your MC for this very meaningful occasion. So we're having the first World Emerging Security Forum for 2 consecutive days. Today and tomorrow, it's being held both online and offline with our renowned speakers from home and abroad to better cope with the impact of emerging security. And this forum is being live streamed on the official YouTube channel of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Korea. So we'd like to ask for your active participation. Thank you. And now we'd like to begin the first session, Health Security Session. It's under the theme of international cooperation to strengthen international responses to an emerging health crisis. This session intends to assess the achievements and limitations of global governance in responses to the health security crisis and find ways to improve it. The health security session will consist of 2 keynote speeches and a panel discussion and a Q&A session. Today, we will have 2 keynote speeches. The first keynote speech will be delivered by Mr. Tedros Ghebreyesus, Director General of the World Health Organization. He cannot attend in person today, but he will be joining us in real time via webcam. And next, we will have a keynote speech delivered by Mr. Richard Hatchett, Chief Executive Officer of Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations. He will be sharing his remarks via video as well. And for a panel discussion, we have our chairperson, Mr. Jerome Kim, on the stage, Director General of the International Vaccine Institute. He will lead a session with the special panelists, so I would like to pass the microphone to our chairperson after the keynote session. And for your information, all staff and participants at the site have thoroughly completed precautionary measures to prevent the spread of COVID-19. In addition, we ask for your understandings that there is a screen between the seats on the stage, so our panelists will give a presentation without wearing a mask. Thank you very much for your understanding as well. So with that, we will begin the health security session. Now, ladies and gentlemen, please allow me to invite Mr. Tedros Ghebreyesus, Director General of the World Health Organization, for his keynote speech. So as I mentioned earlier, he's joining us in real time, so please join me in welcoming him.
감사합니다.
Thank you, Dr. Tedros. So if you're ready, you may have the floor now.
Thank you. 감사합니다. Excellencies, dear colleagues and friends, let me begin by thanking the Republic of Korea for hosting this event and for its leadership in global health security. As chair of the support group for global infectious disease response in Geneva and the group of Friends of Solidarity for Global Health Security in New York. The COVID-19 pandemic has demonstrated that a pandemic is so much more than a health crisis. It affects societies, economies, politics, and national security. COVID-19 has now officially killed more than 5 million people. They're just the reported deaths. We know the real number is much higher. As we speak, Europe is in the grip of another wave of cases and deaths. The global inequity in access to vaccines, combined with the uneven and inconsistent use of public health measures, is prolonging the pandemic, giving the virus more room to move and mutate. And an unknown number of people are now living with long COVID, a disease we don't understand. Health systems have been overwhelmed. Millions have missed out on essential life-saving health services. Progress against HIV, tuberculosis, malaria, and many other diseases has stalled or gone backwards. Millions of children have missed out on routine vaccinations and months of education. Millions of people have lost their jobs or been plunged into poverty. The global economy is still clawing its way out of recession. Political divisions have deepened nationally and globally. Inequalities have widened. Science has been undermined. Misinformation has abounded. And it will all happen again unless the nations of the world can come together to say with one voice, never again. At its heart, the pandemic is a crisis of solidarity that has been exposed and exacerbated by fundamental weaknesses in the global health architecture. Complex and fragmented governance, inadequate financing, and insufficient systems and tools. Voluntary mechanisms have not solved these challenges. In fact, they have made them worse. The only way we can solve them is with a binding treaty or agreement between nations. A pact forged from the recognition that we have no future but a common future. Such a treaty or agreement could set out high-level agreed principles to strengthen solidarity and equity, with a One Health approach that addresses the intimate links between the health of humans, animals, and the planet that sustains us. We seek the support of all countries for such an agreement, which will be the subject of a special session of the World Health Assembly at the end of this month. In the past week, we have seen the power of treaties to address shared threats. At COP26, the Conference of the Parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Of course, it's not perfect, but bringing nations together to find common ground is the only way to make sustainable progress against common threats. We have treaties on nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons, and many other human-made threats. Surely, the world can agree on the need for a common approach to threats that come from our relationship with nature. Such an agreement would provide the overarching framework to foster greater international cooperation and provide a platform for strengthening global health security in 4 key areas. First, better governance. The governance of global health security is complex, fragmented, and has failed to ensure effective collective action and equitable access to vaccines and other tools. High-level threats need high-level political engagement, which is why we support the idea of a head of state council anchored in WHO to provide high-level political leadership for rapid and coordinated action. We propose the Council could be supported by a ministerial standing committee, which WHO member states are now working to establish under the WHO Executive Board. Second, better financing. Cycles of panic and neglect have created an unstable and unpredictable financing ecosystem for global health security. Strengthening the world's defenses demands financing that's truly additional, predictable, equitable, and aligned with national, regional, and global priorities. A mechanism financed solely from voluntary development assistance will only increase competition for already scarce resources. WHO supports the idea of a financial intermediary fund established at the World Bank for additional financing to address gaps identified by WHO and financed by countries and regional organizations on a burden-sharing basis. Third, we need better systems and tools to predict, prevent, detect, and respond rapidly to outbreaks with epidemic and pandemic potential. Already, WHO has taken steps to start building some of those tools. In September, we opened the WHO Hub for Pandemic and Epidemic Intelligence in Berlin, a new center designed to foster greater sharing of data and information between countries and to improve global surveillance by harnessing the power of artificial intelligence and other cutting-edge technologies. It's based on a principle of collaborative intelligence. Other initiatives are in development, including the WHO BioHub system to provide a reliable, safe, and transparent mechanism for countries to share novel biological materials. We're also piloting the Universal Health and Preparedness Review, a peer review mechanism for enhancing national preparedness modeled on the Universal Periodic Review used by the United Nations Human Rights Council. Recently, we established a permanent international scientific advisory group for origins of novel pathogens, or SEGO, to establish a more systematic way of identifying the source of new outbreaks. And fourth, the world needs a strengthened, empowered, and sustainably financed WHO at the center of the global health architecture. With 194 member states and 152 country offices, WHO has unique expertise, a unique global mandate, unique global reach, and unique global legitimacy. But over several decades, WHO has been progressively weakened by a debilitating imbalance between assessed and voluntary earmarked contributions that distorts our budget and constrains our ability to deliver what our member states expect of us. One of the greatest risks to global health security now is to further weaken WHO or to further fragment the global health architecture. The COVID-19 pandemic is a powerful demonstration that health is not a luxury, but a human right, not a cost, but an investment, not simply an outcome of development, but the foundation of social, economic, and political stability and security. In the coming months and years, other crises will demand our attention and distract us from the urgency of taking action now. Now is the time for all countries to make the choice to invest in a healthier, safer, and fairer future. Kamsahamnida. I thank you.
Dr. Ted Ross, thank you very much for your meaningful words and thank you for sharing insights and thank you once again for joining us in real time. With that, this time, we would like to have Mr. Richard Hatchett, Chief Executive Officer of Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, for a keynote speech. So he has sent us a pre-recorded video. So ladies and gentlemen, let's get our attention to the screen with a big round of applause.
It is indeed an honor to join the World Emerging Security Forum this evening, and I am just sorry that my schedule did not permit me to join you in person. I want to say a special word of thanks to Minister Chung and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for the invitation to address you, and to Dr. Kim for the kind introduction. Health security and international cooperation to strengthen international responses to an emerging health security crisis is an urgent topic for our times, both because of our experiences during the pandemic and because we face similar and perhaps graver threats in the future. The issue of global governance in response to a health security crisis and how to improve it is one that we have struggled with during the COVID pandemic. The fact that we were not prepared for such a crisis is evident. The fact that we have not solved the challenges of governance is reflected in the dismal equity gap that has emerged between rich and poor nations in terms of their access to critical medical countermeasures, especially vaccines. Some of our problems with global governance derive from our inability to set aside other unrelated conflicts, other causes for polarization. This is sad, tragic, and unnecessary. I often remind political leaders that the United States and the Soviet Union, at the height of the Cold War, worked together to eradicate smallpox in one of the greatest public health achievements of the 20th century. We should have been able to set aside the conflicts of our day to meet the common threat. But some of our problems are also structural. I will give two examples. The first relates to the skills and competencies required to respond effectively. This has required the partnership of the public and private sectors, the input of nonprofit organizations, and the engagement of civil society. For a threat that is global and that permeates society from top to bottom, we do not have existing institutional structures or relevant organizational experience at hand. We have had to create a kind of multi-sectoral multilateralism in real time, and this has not been easy. The second structural problem relates to the unfolding nature of the problem presented by the pandemic over time and in space. The need to adapt our response to local conditions in response to a threat we only partially understand, in light of pressures that change over time and from place to place, make it extremely difficult to see how global governance can be achieved or be effective. We indeed have much to learn from our collective experience of the pandemic over the last 2 years. There are reasons for optimism for the future, however. Some of these derive from the innovative technologies that have been accelerated by the pandemic, some from the testing and validation of new concepts of preparedness, some from the emergence of new institutional arrangements like the ACT Accelerator and COVAX, which provide an improvable model for the future, some from the emergence of regional partnerships that will strengthen over time and enhance our mutual security, and some from the political will that now exists to ensure that this kind of catastrophe does not happen again in the future. Ultimately, I am an optimist. As Churchill is supposed to have said, no victory is complete, no defeat ever final. We are making progress against the pandemic, but we have not achieved the ideal of equity that we aspired to. This is a stain and a failure on our record that cannot be eradicated. But the collective global effort, as sloppy as it has been, has for the first time ever in human history mitigated a global pandemic, saving millions of lives and reducing the economic damage the pandemic might otherwise have caused. In the long light of history, as we gain the perspective of time, this truth will emerge. We should recognize what we have accomplished, even in its clear and unacceptable imperfection, as we strive to learn the lessons of the pandemic and to do much, much better in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your meaningful keynote speech. And now we will have a panel discussion. We have Mr. Ziram Kim, chairperson, and also Mr. Yan-Jong Hwang, a senior fellow for global health at the Council on Foreign Relations, as a panelist on the stage. Thank you very much for your time and your attendance. Thank you. And as a panelist online, we are joined by Ms. Chung Eui-yong, Commissioner of the Korea Disease Control and Prevention Agency. And we're also joined by Ms. Anurda Gupta, Deputy Chief Executive Officer of Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance as well. Thank you once again for your time today. And ladies and gentlemen, for your information, during the discussion session, those who are joining us online could leave any questions in the comment box. And those who are joining here at the site can send their questions through the QR code that you can find on your tables. So please, with us until the very end. And ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to ask for your active participation. Thank you, and we will try very hard to answer your questions as well. And now I'd like to pass over the microphone to our chairperson, Mr. Jerome Kim. And ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome him with a big round of applause.
Thank you, and good day to everyone. The structure of this panel is that I will read the questions that were posed to the panelists, and then they will each be in turn given an opportunity to answer. We'll take questions and answers, and if in the absence of those, then if we have time, we'll go into some prepared questions and answers for each of the panelists. So the questions. First, how can we improve the global health security governance leadership to ensure its sustainability? Second, what are the specific measures to reinforce preventive response capabilities in the event of a health security crisis? How can we address the key issues such as information sharing, confidence building, and burden sharing to strengthen all-stage responses? Third, what do you expect from each actor to ensure that multi-layered and inclusive global health security governance works effectively? What is the expected role of the state? Fourth, what are the key challenges for the international community to reduce the capability gap between developed and developing countries in terms of health security responses? What are the solutions? Fifth, which factors should be considered in utilizing emerging technologies to strengthen the capability to respond to health security crises? How do we find a balance between security and ethical issues that may arise in the process? So let's turn first to Dr. Chung Eui-yong, the director of KDCA.
Good evening. I am the Commissioner of the Korea Disease Control and Prevention Agency. I am Eui-yong Chung. Now, first of all, I would like to thank the Director General of the World Health Organization, Tedros Ghebreyesus, and also thank Dr. Jerome Kim, Director General of the International Vaccine Institute, and also I'd like to thank everyone for joining us at this panel. And it is a great pleasure for me to be taking part in this forum to discuss the global health security governance. Now, the world has been going through an unprecedented pandemic, which has been showing to all over the world that a pandemic is not just a health crisis, that it can have repercussions throughout the society. Now, from the very beginning of the outbreak, Korea has been faring relatively well thanks to the active participation by the Korean citizens as well as the central and the local government's strong response. And also, in order to control the infection, we have had 3T system as well as social distancing and vaccination. In a way, we have been unrolling a comprehensive response. So, for example, broad-based testing and tracing and quarantine and treatment and also personal health protocols were able to prevent widespread infection. And this year, we have been trying to control the infection through a vaccination campaign. Now, more recently, in order to minimize the economic damages, now, based on the high vaccination rate, we are now gradually trying to go back to normal. But then now, with the lessened social distancing, the people's contacts are increasing, and also there have been an increase in the breakthrough infections among the elderly. So we see that throughout the world, including Korea, COVID-19 is still an ongoing threat, and we still have a lot of challenges left in order to overcome this crisis. Now, for the world, as we went through this COVID-19 crisis, we were able to see once again that individual countries' efforts will not be enough to overcome an infectious pandemic. Now, because of the transnational nature of the pandemic, what we need is a stronger global health security governance and to provide support to enhance the capability of the low and middle income countries who have weaker healthcare system, and to come up with specific methods of ensuring equitable distribution of vaccination and therapeutics. And also we need to come up with specific action plan for each approach, and so that we can come up with concrete outcome. Now, first, about strengthening the global security or the global health security governance based on multilateralism. Now, in order to make this possible, we need to strengthen the international health security leadership by strengthening multilateralism so that the different countries can get together to strengthen our public health system. Now, at the World Health Organization General Assembly in May 2021, they announced the installation of the, and also they announced the recommendations of the IPPPR, IOAC, and also the IHR Review Committee, and also the international society through the WHO General Assembly, G7, and the G20 summits have several times repeated their consensus on the fact that the WHO has to play the role of the center in the multilateral cooperation for the global health security governance. So based on this consensus, we need to come up with action plans based on the recommendations that have been presented to prepare against the future pandemic. And they could include revision of the IHR and pandemic treaty, for example, so that we can lay the legal basis. But then it appears as if there are some differences among the different countries regarding how to achieve those goals. And as we have suffered difficulties globally because of the pandemic, I do hope that we will be able to come to a meaningful agreement among the different countries to respond to future pandemic. Now, of course, the path toward coordinating the different views toward an agreement will take a long time, and I do realize that it is not going to happen overnight. But in the course of working toward an agreement, different countries are still going all out to fight off the pandemic. And now, perhaps what we need at this time is to strengthen transnational infection surveillance capability and also the development of therapeutics and vaccines so that we will be able to continuously remain vigilant against signs of future pandemic. And on that note, the WHO's intelligence hub established to strengthen global surveillance and also the BioHub are expected to play important roles down the road. And Korea will also be an active participant in these initiatives and endeavors so that we will be able to develop the capabilities to globally prepare against pandemic in the future. And second is the need to increase investment to strengthen the capability of the vulnerable countries in the international healthcare. Now, for the COVID-19 health materials and also accessibility to vaccines and therapeutics, there has been clear gap between the developed and the developing countries. Now, the WHO, in its briefing in early October, has set out the goal of vaccinating 40% of the population by the end of this year and also 70% of the population by mid-next year. And this was also ascertained in the G20 summit declaration. But we see that in the African continent, the vaccination rate remains below 6%. And also, even inside the African continent, the gap has been widening with only 5 countries out of the 54 African countries reaching 40% of vaccination rate. So we need to strengthen the support to the low and middle income countries, because this is not just for humanitarian purpose, but it is also from the perspective of the health security. As you can see from COVID-19, the Delta variant and other variants have occurred from countries where the vaccination rate is low and the healthcare system is insufficient. And this has prolonged the COVID-19 crisis and has also affected the social and economic circumstances of the countries, of all the countries. And also in these countries, in the vulnerable countries, it is also not easy to analyze the genome of the variants and not easy to conduct diagnostics. So we also need to invest into the capability building. And also, including the efforts to provide support to the vulnerable countries on a bilateral basis through the ODA. We also need to have multilateral support, for example, to reduce the capability gap between the developed and the developing countries. For example, providing technology support between the infection control institutions and to provide the technology support for manufacturing, vaccines and therapeutics, as well as the personal protection equipment. Now, if we can enhance the accessibility to vaccine among the COVAX AMC countries through multilateral approach, then I believe that the whole world will be able to achieve similar level of vaccination. Korea, from the beginning, has also been an active participant in the JHSA and COVAX. As we have committed to $200 million of contribution, we have also provided vaccine to Thailand, Vietnam, and Iran. Korea will continue to be an active participant in the international effort to provide support to the vulnerable countries, for example, through the KOICA as well as the Korea Foundation for International Healthcare. Now, as they say, crisis is also an opportunity. Now, through COVID-19, this may be a chance for us to strengthen multilateral leadership based on the consensus in the international community regarding COVID-19. And of course, in this process, there are some realistic challenges, for example, coming up with a sustainable financing for the WHO and other multilateral institutions. But then I do hope that we will be able to seize this opportunity, gather our wisdom so that we'll be able to overcome this crisis together. Korea will continue to be a responsible member of the international community. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chung, for your thoughtful comments, for your recommendations, and for your advocacy. I'd next like to go to Ms. Anuradha Gupta from Gavi. Ma'am?
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes, can you hear me, please? Yes. Okay, so thank you, Dr. Jerome. It's so nice to see you and also the fellow panelists here and join this very important conversation. And it was so heartening to hear Dr. Toomas and the really commitment of Republic of Korea to continue to support this very important agenda and make the requisite investments. And on behalf of Gavi, I really do want to acknowledge the tremendous support that we have received from the Republic of Korea for the leadership. And I would also want to particularly thank Dr. Eui-yong for your leadership in this regard. The Republic of Korea became a donor to Gavi in 2010, much earlier than the Asian peers, and Korea's financial support has steadily increased ever since and has really been instrumental to the alliance playing its part in this pandemic response. So really turning my attention to the questions, I just want to highlight a couple of things. First of all, I just do think that it is so important to embrace the notion of global solidarity and equitable access to tools and solutions for all countries and also for all communities and populations within individual countries. And we have seen that with ACT Accelerator and the 3 pillars that have been set up, particularly COVAX pillar, we had more than 190 economies coming together under COVAX umbrella to actually express their complete support to the idea of equitable access to COVID-19 vaccines. And that itself is a very important compact and contract to have, because this is something that we did not see at the time of H1N1 H1N1. And at that time, even the discussion about lower and middle income countries having access to H1N1 tools, solutions, vaccines did not even get started. So I just do want to highlight this important issue. I think the second issue really is the issue of financing. And one of the things that we have learned based on the experience of COVAX so far is that time is of the essence. So if in a pandemic situation, there aren't existing structures and existing capacities, and financing is slow to come by, then we are losing precious time. And therefore, our ability to get ahead of the virus is severely compromised. And at the same time, I think one of the even bigger lessons is that there would continue to be a huge gap between the capacity of lower middle income countries and advanced economies to actually weigh in with the requisite level of investments. And therefore, it is going to be critically important for those who are better off to actually lean in with the right amount of support for those who are not equally fortunate. And the whole challenge of inequity in terms of access to COVID-19 tools, particularly vaccines, has already been highlighted. And I think subsumed within that is the critical issue of financing and where does it come from? Because we are seeing a lot of lower middle income countries reeling under the economic fallout of the pandemic. Their economies have been severely hit. The fiscal space is extremely stretched and constrained. And if now more advanced economies do not step up to the plate, and in addition would have high expectations from these countries to additionally invest in pandemic preparedness, there is going to be a huge challenge. The third thing on governance that I really want to say is that, of course, when this pandemic struck, we saw that there was nothing that existed. And so therefore, there was a real scramble. And then, of course, ACT Accelerator was put together. And we have seen the three pillars doing very good work. And particularly, the pace of development of vaccines has just been phenomenal. Now, the thing for us to really reflect on is how do we make sure that we have a very serious and important critique of the lessons coming out of COVAX pillar and ACT Accelerator, and then really come to an assessment of what is working or what has worked and what needs to be retained. But what are the difficulties that this governance structure faced, which can be improved upon going forward. And one of the things, as I said, for example, as I speak today, COVAX has shipped close to 500 million doses. And a large part of these doses is to those countries that would not have been able to have any kind of access to COVID-19 vaccines. So I guess there is an opportunity for us to step back and not to reinvent the wheel going forward and really come to an alignment about those elements which have worked during this pandemic around the pillars that have already been erected. Some of the innovations that we have seen in this space are remarkable that I really want to highlight. For example, one of the things from my perspective is really end-to-end collaboration, which we have never seen in the past. So for example, Gavi Alliance as an entity has worked on scaling up access to those vaccines which are already developed and which are approved for use by WHO. But we have not in the past systematically engaged with an entity like CEPI that actually now proactively works on research and development of new vaccine candidates. And I do recall that when Ebola struck in 2014-15 in West Africa, Gavi had to step in beyond its mission to actually incentivize the development of an Ebola vaccine, because there was a total vacuum in the global architecture for anybody to step up to send a strong signal to the market that vaccines indeed are needed for diseases with epidemic potential. And that is the time when the global community recognized the importance or value of actually setting up a new entity like CEPI, which would focus its attention exclusively on research and development of vaccine candidates for existing diseases or even new pathogens. And I do think that this pandemic has actually leveraged the existence of CEPI, and as a result, under the COVAX pillar, we see CEPI, Gavi, WHO working together, where right from research and development of promising vaccine candidates, to technical and normative guidance, to actually bring in financing to enable particularly those countries that are in need but do not have the financial capability to procure those vaccines by themselves, is all addressed in very seamlessly. So I do think that this is something that probably is of value to maintain as we go forward. One of the things that I do think is also going to be critical if we are serious about pandemic preparedness is to actually bolster the voices of countries in this dialogue. So while the importance of global governance mechanisms is extremely critical, as all of us highlighted, I think it is also important that we create the right kind of governance mechanisms which give adequate space for country voices to weigh in and to be heard. And this is more important because we have seen that even during this pandemic, the trajectory of the disease has played out very differently across different continents and different countries. And while there is huge political appetite to have rapid and equitable access to COVID-19 tools, including vaccines, the communities may not be bought into that political vision. And we have seen that across countries where, despite the fact that now vaccines, COVID-19 vaccines are available, communities are not coming forward to get those shots into their arms. And there is a disconnect between the political establishment and the communities at large. And therefore, I think the critical importance of us listening to what the communities need and want and responding to that and building and maintaining high levels of trust is going to be extremely, extremely important going forward. On financing, one of the, there is a very interesting report that Gavi just funded, which has been published by World Bank, titled Double Shock, Double Recovery, where they of course have highlighted both the economic and health impact of this pandemic, but they've also highlighted how countries now are having to bear the burden of heightened expectations from global community. So on the one hand, they have to maintain their budgets to continue to provide for essential health services, which have come under severe disruption because of the pandemic, and a lot of countries are struggling to maintain their health budgets even at the existing level. The second important requirement now is for countries to put in more and more of their domestic resources in COVID-19 response at a time when the debt service ratios are going up. And then, of course, there is huge expectation about countries weighing in on pandemic preparedness. And I saw one estimation which puts that figure at $5 billion a year for LMICs, something that the countries would struggle to do. So I guess for this this is an important issue that will deserve attention, where as a global community, we will have to find ways of understanding differentiated needs of countries in terms of systems strengthening, in terms of innate capacities to get prepared for pandemics and fight them successfully, and also in terms of financial investments. And I will pause here, Dr. Jerome.
Thank you, Ms. Gupta, for those really insightful comments. And congratulations and thanks to Gavi for your role in the COVAX facility, shipping 500 million doses of COVID-19 vaccines around the world, but also for highlighting the issues around inequity, financing, and some of the lessons learned, and some of the things that we didn't consider before going into implementation of vaccination in countries around the world. So thank you very much. Our final speaker is from the Council on Foreign Relations, Dr. Eui-yong Hwang. Please, sir.
Well, thank you, Dr. Kim. And thanks for the Korean Foreign Minister of Foreign Affairs to invite me to the forum. It's my second time to visit your beautiful country. So it's really a pleasure to be here. So since much has been talked about the governance issues in coping with the health security crisis, I'm going to address these two questions that has been less talked about. That is the issue of reducing the capacity gap between the developed and the developing countries in terms of health security response. And the second, I'd like to speak a little bit about how the issue of utilizing emerging technologies to strengthen the capacity in responding to health security crises. So first of all, the capacity gap, right? Well, this has been a problem, right? A concern in health security response for a long, long time, right? It's precisely that gap, that contributed to the emergence and the rapid spread of many infectious diseases in the developing world and beyond, right? But the development of this more demanding governance institutions since the end of the SARS crisis in 2003, such as the international health regulations, which is the international law, right, to govern the infectious disease outbreaks, actually underscored the gap between the developing and the developed world, right? So, for example, the international health regulations require, right, all the signatory nations to develop a certain core response surveillance capacities, but actually by by 2014, during the Ebola outbreak, for example, the WHO Director General Dr. Margaret Chang admitted, right, majority of the countries still have failed to fulfill those requirements, most of them, of course, in the developing world. But even for the developed countries, as this pandemic has clearly demonstrated, right, this capacity gap is much more complicated than we thought. It's not just a dichotomy, right, that developing countries lack the capacity, developed countries have the capacity, right? Because even for the developed countries like the United States, which scored some of the very highest in the global security index, still failed miserably in responding to the pandemic. So this issue becomes more complicated, when countries started to undertake measures to deal with this pandemic through those emergency extraordinary measures in the effort, what we call securitization in the jargon of international relations literature, right? But this securitization, which treat diseases as an existential national security threat, actually relieves the developed countries the responsibility, right, to help developing countries in accessing, vaccine access, in building their capacity to effectively respond to disease outbreaks. So what are the solutions? Of course, right, I think since many of those countries in the developing world, right, cannot, right, build up that capacity, right, in a short period of time, right, this capacity has to be imported from abroad. Right? So that is why it's important to increase health-related development assistance, but with a focus on building core disease surveillance and response capacity, right, in the developing world. Right? So for countries like China, right, they may use their Health Silk Road or Belt and Road Initiative, which is, by the way, Health Silk Road is a component of China's Belt and Road Initiative. They could use that, right, to invest in developing surveillance response capacities in the developing world. And in the, for countries like United States and G7 or OECD countries, including Korea, right, they could use this Build Back Better World Initiative to invest in, to make this capacity building a top priority. But to make this initiative sustainable, I think we should also focus on partnerships with developing countries. Right? So, for those countries like China, well, they could use those partnerships and build it during this pandemic, right, to further build the developing countries' surveillance and response capacities, right? While in the meantime also benefit China, right, to expand its international market share of their medical products. And the United States, too, could benefit from that process by cooperating with countries in the developing world. And third, I think for the donor countries, right, that provide those health-related development assistance, they should also strengthen cooperation among them. Right? That, unfortunately, is not the case between U.S. and China. Right? When they both, for example, launched their vaccine diplomacy, right, the purpose is to expand their geopolitical influence. So building the capacity of the developing countries is actually not a priority of the donor states. I think for countries like China and the United States, and then broadly defined by the high-income countries, like Korea, right, they could jointly support the disease surveillance and response capacity building in the developing world. Right? China and the United States, they could build upon this 2016, the memo, right, which allowed them to cooperate in this establishment of African CDC. Right? This model, right, this pattern of cooperation could be expanded to the capacity building in the developing world. Right? And of course, that partnership should not just be confined between states. Right? We should also encourage the participation of the private sector and other non-state actors, like the Gates Foundation. Right? Indeed, Gates Foundation has been cooperating with China, for example, in building their Global Health Institute to develop drugs, specifically for the developing world. Right? And then we also need to consider the issue of regime complexity. That is, how those non-health actors, right, or non-health issues, similar non-health related issues, they could affect the global health security governance. But this is what we call the global governance for health. Right? For example, on the issue of IP waiver, right, it's time to start to discuss within the WTO framework, right, to encourage more flexible use of IP waiver during the pandemic and beyond, allowing developing countries with their pharmaceutical development capacities to develop and produce their own drugs and vaccines. So these are some of the proposed solutions. I think that unfortunately, not much has been done in those areas. And finally, I'm going to briefly talk about the issue of the use of the emerging technologies, right, in responding to health security crises. Right? Well, the good thing of the use of those technologies is that, right, these surveillance techniques and instruments, right, including AI, big data, QR codes, right, can be used to track and stop the spread of virus, strengthening our capacity to respond to health security crises. Right? Using this technology, right, it's not confined, right, to countries like China. We know South Korea actually is the model, right, in effectively using this technology. But the concerns are that there's this potential abuse of the technology, right? The slope can be very slippery, right, without the checks and balances, right, without the checks and state power, without an effective accountability structure, right? This, you might have heard, but in China now they have this new term, right, called time-space companion. Right? This is different from the close contact we're talking about. It's like a relaxation of this close contact concept. So under this concept, anybody, right, who over the past 14 days, right, the signal of their cell phones shows they have been in the same time space for more than 10 minutes will be considered a time-space companion, and therefore they're going to see their health code showing the color of yellow. That means they need to be subject to mandatory PCR tests, right? Multiple usually. Right? So this is all raises this ethical dilemma, right? Because these efforts, by those interventions, part of this what we call the securitization efforts, right? The tools and technologies used, right, simultaneously also push the response of the disease response, right, to the bureaucracies, giving them the power, right, to override the civil liberties of persons, right, living with the diseases, right, or their close contacts, right? These people would be considered either diseased or dangerous and are subject to, as I said, mandatory tests, quarantine measures, right, and lockdowns. So that expanded reach of the state, well, that is a growing concern, right? That this pandemic may provide a proof of concept, right, for the so-called surveillance state that promises to control every facet of people's lives, right, in the post-pandemic era. But I don't think this is a major concern, right, in liberal democracies. In fact, as we have seen in Korea, right, consolidated democracies, right, they used extensively the surveillance technologies in pandemic response, but they generally have managed to emerge from the crises without significantly compromising democratic standards. So can we find a balance between the two, by protecting people's health and protecting the civil liberties and privacy and human rights? I think in the years ahead, right, we need to basically balance the risk, this downside risks associated with the surveillance state, with the evident benefits of the global health security agenda, especially in terms of mobilizing the political leadership and resources for the management of emerging and re-emerging infectious diseases. And we also need to do better risk management, adopting a more targeted approach in pandemic response. Right? Those non-traditional security problems, such as pandemic, should be better understood through the context of risk, right? That emphasizes prevention, precaution, right? Rather than securitization, that focuses on emergency mobilization responding to urgent security threats or dangers. So I'm favoring an approach of desecuritization now. That is, it's time for countries to move away from a containment-based approach, to focus on mitigation, right? To lower the expectations of the people, to learn to live with the virus. So with that, I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you to our panelists for their responses to the questions. And I think, if possible, we'd like to pose a question to each of the panelists. Dr. Chung, what defines success nationally, globally, and do the goals need to be reset for 2022?
Thank you for your question. Around the world, the Delta variant is becoming more prevalent. Eradicating the COVID-19 is very difficult. And along with that, the effectiveness of vaccines have become limited. We are seeing the emergence of new variants. And there are limitations to containing the spread of the virus around the world. So we are facing a number of risk factors. And against this backdrop, we have to maximize vaccination while taking antiviral measures and strengthening our response system in order to make COVID-19 a disease to be managed. And in the process, we need to strike a balance between anti-COVID fight and normal life. To this end, we have to boost vaccination around the world, and as recommended by the WHO, when it comes to production, distribution, and administration of a vaccine, the infrastructure should be expanded while providing more therapeutics for severe cases and to prevent deaths. And as pointed out by panelists, it is important to strengthen the capacity of each individual country. So in order to do that, we have to provide training in order to help them better equipped with diagnostic, treatment, and prevention of COVID-19. We are still facing a lot of uncertainty, and it is important for us to build a scientific foundation and basis. And this is where knowledge sharing and research collaboration around the world comes in. So this will help us achieve our goals toward COVID. We at agency is committed to making continuous efforts to work toward these common goals.
Thank you, Dr. Chung. That was a very succinct description, I think, of what Korea hopes for and hopes to have accomplished in 2022. Ms. Gupta, under the theme, Build Back Better, what needs to be better and what needs to be built? A continuation of some of the discussion points that you had raised.
So first of all, I do believe that no crisis should be wasted. And we should not allow COVID-19 pandemic to either be wasted or be forgotten. And we've seen in the past that our memories are very short. So we wake up to a crisis, we scramble, we find our way out of it, and then we forget about that and go back to our usual way of working. And I think that must not happen after this. So that's the first thing. So we have an opportunity to really embrace some of the lessons, as I said earlier, and build back better. So what are those lessons from my standpoint? First, Dr. Jerome, is that we have to scale up our investments in prevention. Anything that can be prevented must be prevented, because prevention is better than cure. And we know that vaccines can be a highly cost-effective public health intervention which prevents and averts disease and illness, particularly for the poorest communities. So therefore, I think the vaccines and other tools that are able to prevent diseases must be prioritized and adequately supported through investments. The second thing, I think this pandemic has again highlighted the value of public-private partnerships. So I did touch on this, that we've seen that UN institutions, for example, have certain inbuilt or inherent limitations of engaging with non-state actors and, or going beyond the policies and procedures that constrain them. And that is why Gavi was born, in 2000, and of which WHO and UNICEF were founding members. And the whole idea was that there should be innovation and really leveraging a diverse stakeholders and partners. And I think in this pandemic, this has again been tested. So we know that during the last 20 years, because of the scale-up of vaccines that happened as a result of Gavi's effort, 70% reduction has actually been achieved in vaccine-preventable child deaths, which is phenomenal. But even in this pandemic, what we saw was that some of the, advanced purchase agreements that certain other institutions could not do because of their inherent limitations, Gavi was able to step forward and do them, because we needed to incentivize manufacturers, we needed to provide them financial backing, and constantly, think about newer, more innovative ways of creating incentives to have timely access to vaccines. So I think just the value of public-private partnerships is something that needs to be further strengthened. The third thing that I would say is long-term commitments and long-term investments in health systems. So I feel that, for example, Gavi for the last several years, more than a decade actually, has been investing very aggressively in health system strengthening, particularly immunization delivery systems. And we have seen during the pandemic that those immunization delivery systems are coming in handy for countries to start delivering COVID-19 vaccination so quickly. For example, in India, where systematic investments were made by the national government, in strengthening frontline health workforce and several other systemic components, we saw India leveraging those investments of more than a decade to actually provide 1 billion inoculations to their population within a span of about 7 months. And we are seeing that with regard to other Gavi-supported countries, where the investments that we have made in health workforce, in cold chain, in data, in demand, they are being leveraged. So I really think there is no magic bullet or silver bullet for pandemics, and we really need to systematically and sustainably build health systems for us to prepare countries to combat any kind of pandemic in future. Another thing that I would want to say is innovation. And we have, for example, Gavi really encourages and pilots a lot of innovations. So during the last several years now, we have been, for example, investing a lot of money in digital data tools. And what we saw was, so DHIS2 is, for example, just one illustration of innovations that we have invested big time in and help countries, put them in place. And what we saw was that countries actually leveraged DHIS2 to combine COVID-19 surveillance modules very quickly. In several countries where we have been supporting digital capacity building tools, for example, they came in handy for countries to start training their health workforce and vaccinators for COVID-19 vaccination, without having to do in-person trainings. So I guess the point that I'm making is whether it is financial instruments, like IFIM-like financial instruments, or it is a lot of delivery-related innovations, they are extremely useful, and that's something that we should continue to encourage. And I think the last thing that I would want to say is equity. And I think equity is something that has to now become the front and center of all our efforts. We have seen one thing during this pandemic, that this pandemic has impacted the whole world, but has disproportionately impacted the poor. And I think we need to provide protection to the poor, and therefore we need to take our solutions, such as vaccines and other public health services and interventions, to the poorest, most marginalized, vulnerable populations as a matter of priority. For example, if you look at the vaccination space, then even now we have 22 million children, right, who did not receive even a single dose of any vaccine last year in 2020. And this was 3 million more than the number in 2019. And I think that just goes to show that we still have highly vulnerable, marginalized populations that live in extreme poverty poverty that do not have access to a simple intervention such as vaccines. But as we systematically dissected data, we also realized that lack of vaccination is actually an indicator of compounded vulnerabilities, because in these households, besides extreme poverty, women do not have access to antenatal care, skilled birth attendance, contraception, or these households simply do not have access to water or cleansing agents. And that is why when the pandemic struck, and we were all talking about these non-pharmaceutical COVID-19 appropriate behaviors like washing their hands, these populations don't even have drinking water, right? Water to drink. And clearly this is a solution that would never work for them or never resonate with them. So I just think that equity is something very important. And I would actually want to link surveillance, disease surveillance and intelligence, with the equity, because we also see with a lot of vaccines that, if we have strengthened surveillance, then we exactly know what are the communities that are suffering from disproportionate burden of diseases that can spread very fast, such as yellow fever, meningitis, and other. So I just think equity is something we have an opportunity to work on as we build back better.
So thank you very much. It was a complicated answer to a very complicated question, but you moved us from need for a vaccine and for solution through surveillance, through innovation, through equity, and all of those things to impact. So you covered the end-to-end spectrum, and you pointed out places along that entire spectrum where improvements could be made for the next pandemic. So thank you very much. And finally, Dr. Wang, so this is also a rather difficult question, but if you had to say, globally, who is responsible? Should pandemic response be governed by committee or by simple self-interest of nations?
Well, thank you for the question. The simple answer is that we cannot rely on the so-called informed self-interest nations, right? We have seen how, the nation states themselves become a problem in effective pandemic response, right? In terms of investigating the origins of the pandemic, right? In terms of the early response by providing the desperately needed information in an accurate and a speedy manner, right? And in terms of the distribution of the vaccines, right? So how countries, right, in order to protect their own population, right, turn to vaccine nationalism, right? That actually leads to, actually highlights the importance of COVAX, right? The vaccine multilateral initiative, right, that seeks to provide vaccines, to those low-income countries, right, to developing countries, with the goal, right, providing vaccines for at least 20% of the population of every participating country. Right, but here you cannot say, right, that as a multilateral initiative or as a PPP, public-private partnership, this pandemic response should be governed by a committee or a pillar like this. Because in this crowded global health governance space, it is just one actor, right? We have multiple actors, state actors, non-state actors, PPPs, foundations, etc. Right? So far, we don't, even the WHO, right, supposedly the leader in coordinating the pandemic response still has shown its limits, right, in coordinating international response to the pandemic. COVAX is no exception, right? As we have talked about, right, even though, right, it seeks to distribute 2 billion doses by the end of 2021, but as of, I think, mid-November, it only delivered 435 million COVID vaccines. That's short of the expected 640 million target planned for this time frame. In fact, even though they achieved that objective of providing 2 billion doses of vaccine by the end of this year, still it can only cover very small percentage of the population. In the lower income countries in particular, this is a concern. Only 2.5% of the population in those country group actually have been fully vaccinated. And also, as a multilateral initiative, it's not as efficient as a bilateral initiative sometimes. We know China, for example, primarily they focus on the bilateral initiative in distributing the vaccines internationally. So far, it has delivered 1.1 billion doses, and they expected to deliver 2 billion by the end of this year, according to President Xi Jinping. So this bilateral initiative itself is a formidable competitor of the multilateral initiative like COVAX. So I think it's important to coordinate among these different programs, among these multiple stakeholders, including the private sector. We may have to encourage China to contribute or donate more to COVAX, more significantly. And it is also important for countries, the special vaccine makers, to work together to scale up global vaccine supply. I think that is probably more important, actually a more urgent concern we have to deal with now.
Thank you. And I'm just going to ask one question to Ms. Gupta, because it's actually maybe an opportunity also to respond to Dr. Wang. But the question from the audience was, faced with the global spread of COVID-19, many countries chose to adopt measures that put their own national interest first, without regard for international cooperation. How should we deal with these trends? And also, if you have comments on the previous question, please feel free to make them.
Yeah, so I guess this is indeed the biggest challenge that COVAX has faced. That when the idea of COVAX was floated, there was huge support from virtually every country. And that is why, as I mentioned, we saw more than 190 countries becoming members of COVAX. However, COVAX was also designed to really as a mechanism that would pool global demand and discourage bilateral agreements. But what we saw in reality was that given a highly constrained market, vaccine market, the desire of the countries that could actually afford to put big time money into purchase of vaccines to protect their own populations trumped their sort of avowed commitment to an equitable global response. And I think that's why, COVAX, though sort of created a very diversified vaccine portfolio with 11 vaccine candidates, the manufacturers actually ended up prioritizing bilateral deals. And COVAX struggled to access doses even in cases where there were legitimate agreements. And as has just been noted, there was this whole ambition of supplying 1 billion doses actually to the advanced market commitment countries, which are really lower middle income countries that we recognize needed our support. And out of that, as I said, about 300 out of a total of about 500 million doses that I highlighted, the AMC countries actually got access to more than 350 million so far, but there is a very rapid ramp up now. And our expectation is that by the end of this year, COVAX total supply could be between 800 million to 1 billion doses, with the rest coming next year in the first half. But that poses another issue to me, and something that I was trying to highlight, that now we are moving away from a supply constraint situation really into a delivery space. And as I highlighted, it is going to be very critical that we support countries to now deliver those doses that they are receiving successfully in a highly prioritized manner. And of course, we are seeing a very mixed picture with some countries racing ahead of some others, which are still struggling with health systems capacities. So I think going forward, really, if we have this whole contract, right, or compact, where, there are very clear and firm commitments that countries have to make in order to contribute to this whole notion of global solidarity and equitable access that I highlighted right in the beginning of my comments, I think that would be the way forward. They have to protect their own populations, but in a pandemic situation, they also have to look at the whole globe as their own population, because nobody is safe until everyone is safe.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Dr. Jong, Ms. Gupta, Dr. Wang, for a very interesting session.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And ladies and gentlemen, let's give a big round of applause to our panelists and a chairperson. Thank you once again to all of our panelists who joined us via online and here on site. And thank you once again to Mr. Jerome Kim for leading the session. And ladies and gentlemen, this brings us to the end of our first session of the first WESF. Thank you once again for your participation, and we'd like to have all of our participants tomorrow as well. For your information, on day 2, we will start with the special roundtable on health security at 2 p.m. Korean Standard Time, followed by session 2, cybersecurity, international cooperation to realize safe and peaceful cyberspace at 6 p.m. Korean Standard Time. And then we'd like to have the last session, which will be session 3, emerging technologies and security, development and use of emerging technologies and international cooperation for peace and security. That's going to be start from 7:40 p.m. Korean Standard Time. So ladies and gentlemen, honorable guests, thank you once again for your attendance today. And this has been Jessica Lee, your MC. Thank you and see you tomorrow.